This is the Candid podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. Before I begin here, I just wanted to let you all know that this was originally supposed to be a mini cast. But once I started gathering up my thoughts and jotting down some notes, this subject just kept growing and growing. So I decided to go ahead and make it a full-blown podcast instead. The things I do for you guys, because I'm a man of the people. Given how modern society continues to operate these days, a commonplace gesture that used to be considered chivalrous and pretty much a standard practice has now come under intense debate for numerous reasons that I'll get to very shortly. What makes this particular situation even harder to solve is that it seems to invoke some fairly visceral reactions and cause a healthy amount of divisiveness between the genders whenever it's brought up. Most women still seem to feel that a man should pay for expensive first dates right off the rip, while more and more men seem to be answering with a no, or at least a strong, it really depends on the woman and how long you've been talking, but leaning towards no. And by the way, even though the title of this podcast sounds like I'm referring to the very first date, I'm really speaking about the first few dates at the very least. So keep that in mind as we move along. Anyway, both genders are going to come with their separate lists of reasons why they feel the way they do, and plenty of examples to go along with them. And both genders will most likely remain firmly rooted in their beliefs. So that's where I'm going to step in. Contrary to popular belief, I try to remain as objective as possible with all my content, even if my opinions may appear as if they traditionally lean more in certain directions. I'm firmly and wholeheartedly against the whole 50-50 rule, where blame must always be placed equally on both sides, even if that's not the case. Because what you're essentially doing in these kinds of situations is rewarding the party who's more at fault, or even totally at fault, by assigning part of the blame to the party that's mostly innocent. And all that does is incentivize gaslighting, continued poor behavior, and reward a complete lack of accountability. Two things that I'm vehemently against. So you're not going to hear any of that kind of mess from me either. There are so many examples and situations that I could have used to validate my points during this podcast that I could have ended up going on for hours. But instead, I'm going to take some of the major ones, break them down, and give my personal thoughts on how men should handle the first few dates, especially in this modern dating culture that has more twists, turns, lies, and deceit than a single season of Game of Thrones. So let's go ahead and start moving this cart along, shall we? I'll begin with the most obvious reason men feel a man should instantly begin paying for expensive dates. And it's the reason that I stated at the very beginning of this podcast. The traditional etiquette, so to speak, or standard operating procedure for dating has always been for a man to pay for a fairly expensive first date. A lot of women out there still view a man spending lots of money on a date as a gesture of chivalry, courtesy, or leadership, which to a certain extent I can actually understand. Way back in the old days when a man was trying to, quote, court a woman, he would ask her out on a date, pay for said date, open the door for her, pull the chair out for her, and do all of the things that the definition of a traditional man was supposed to do. That was all fine and dandy back in the day. The problem now is that both modern dating and modern women have evolved into a completely different animal, so men are naturally starting to evolve with them. Modern women nowadays want to be completely independent boss bees who don't need a man, ain't going to be submissive to no man, and generally take every opportunity they can to trash men and tell us how they don't need us and will not allow us to lead in a relationship. These women don't want to behave like traditional women at all until it benefits them. Now, all of a sudden, when a woman gets asked out on a date, they want a traditional man with traditional values along with expensive dates. But the women don't quite feel empowered enough to cover the paycheck in that situation. So they'll be quick to trash a man and call him broke, lame, or even corny for allowing an independent woman to exercise her financial independence and pay for half the check, or simply be willing to go on less expensive dates with a man in the beginning to see how you all get along. More on that in a bit. Sorry, ladies, but it just doesn't work like that. You all don't get to pick and choose when to be traditional women and when not to be traditional women, unless you have a complete simp for a man. At which point, you still don't have a truly strong traditional man, because a real traditional man wouldn't be a simp for a woman anyway. And as usual, ladies, let me clarify that there's a difference between being a traditional woman and a doormat. I'm not saying that you have to allow a man to completely run you over and treat you like you're nothing in order to qualify as being a traditional woman. But there is a nice middle ground between being some modern day man-hating feminist until the check arrives at the table and being completely run over. Bottom line is that if you want men to behave like traditional men and do what traditional men used to do, which is pay for more expensive first dates, then you need to soften up and become more submissive. Why would a man trying to date in these modern times immediately start reaching into his large bills sock and start spending a bunch of money up front for a woman who has a 50-50 chance of turning out to be one of the growing boss bee man haters that only wants a traditional relationship when it works in her favor? If you ladies want to keep acting like a big, bad, modern woman, shame men, and behave like you're God's gift to the entire world, then don't be surprised when traditional men treat you accordingly, if they even bother asking you out at all. Because truth be told, it's getting to the point where more and more men are just walking away from dating completely, and this whole entire subject is becoming less of a factor each and every day. It's unfortunate, but I personally have experienced plenty of modern women not even being kind enough to give you a thank you for opening the door for them. They'll just walk right through it with all of their female entitlement, acting as if it was your job to do that for them. Contrast that with the fact that when I open the door for much older women, think late 60s and 70s, they're so much more kind, pleasant, and thankful that I open the door for them because they come from an era where they valued traditional men and traditional male behavior instead of the one now where traditional men get demonized, stigmatized, and any other kind of ized you can think of. I've heard countless stories of men paying for expensive first dates and not even getting a thank you from the harpy they just took out on said date. Maybe she wasn't into him. Maybe the date didn't go well. Or sometimes the woman feels that $100 plus date still wasn't enough because some other clown spent more on her. No matter the reason, instead of these females behaving like more traditional women and at least expressing some gratitude or just being thankful that the man thought enough of her to take her out on any kind of date, instead, they oftentimes think with their modern minds and show visual displeasure because they're upset, Or even worse, they'll rudely vocalize their issues because they gonna speak their mind and ain't nobody gonna stop them, especially some man. Now, I'm not at all saying that a woman must like a man after he spends a bunch of money on a first date for her. Just that traditional women would at least be thankful and handle letting the man down appropriately and with grace, while modern women could give a rat's ass about if they hurt your feelings or not. With that being the case, why would any man instantly begin paying for expensive dates before he was even sure that a woman's personality and values warranted it? I mean, sure, everyone can put up a front in the beginning, but eventually a person's real values and personality will begin to reveal themselves. So as a man, the best practice is to give it some time to see if them demons start coming out before you even think of shelling out tons of dough for expensive dates. The next point that women love to make for why men should be spending lots of cash on first dates is because it shows a sign of the man's intent or somehow signals that he's invested in her. But again, with how most of these modern women are behaving nowadays, I find this point to be completely laughable because the investment usually only goes one way. And us men have gotten hip to that and aren't falling for the okie doke anymore. So what do I mean by falling for the okie doke? It's pretty simple, actually. And it kind of relates back to my previous point on how women don't act like traditional women anymore. Before all this modern day feminism and social media dating apps began taking over, dating was more intentional on both sides. But nowadays, the intention usually only goes one way. Now, I'm not saying that back in the old days, every single woman only dated one man, because that's never been true. But it was way more commonplace than it is now. These days, women routinely have a roster of men that they matched with on apps and are going out on dates with all at the same time. And when I say roster, I'm talking sometimes up to 5+ men. And often while they're still out there thirst trapping for even more men to date on social media. There's no real investment on the woman's part at all these days. Many of them are just collecting free dates with men they're mildly interested in just to see if one of these men stands out. Or while the woman is waiting for Superman to come along and sweep her off her feet. Meanwhile, most men are usually only investing themselves into that particular woman because he's really interested in her. Again, I'm not saying that all men are like this, but only the top 3 to 5% of men have the luxury of having a roster that could even begin to rival what women have, while most normal men only have 1, maybe 2 women that they're trying to date. So, because of this lack of investment on the woman's part that social media and dating apps have caused, men are often getting used for expensive first dates and then discarded like a dirty paper cup afterwards. And some women are actually extremely proud of the fact that they're doing this, and they have absolutely zero shame with this kind of behavior because, again, it benefits them. Some women will even judge who they're ultimately going to date long term based on which man pays for the most expensive date, which in this day and age is not surprising, but it doesn't make it any less disgusting either. I mentioned this in one of my previous podcasts before about how one of my best friends asked my sister's best friend out on a date, and she literally told my sister that she thought my friend was ugly, but that it was a free date to the movies and free dinner, so she'd go out with him anyway. Multiply that kind of attitude times 30, and that's how a lot of these modern women approach dating these days. Now, I'm not saying that these women are all going out with ugly men just for free food. They could very well find these men that they're dating attractive, but when a woman is going out with 5+ men at the same time, it's pretty inarguable to say that her attention/investment is at about 20% for each man, while those men are often much more invested on their end. There's also plenty of stories of how a woman will block or ghost a man they met on a dating app after they met and had dinner with him, simply because these women were too cowardly and had morals so low that they didn't even respect their date enough to tell him that they weren't interested. And I find that to be the pinnacle of lowlifeness, in my opinion. And yes, that is a word as of right now. And I do realize that the investment, as we're calling it on a first date, is not as deep as it is in a full-blown relationship, but it ain't nothing either. Most men are being prompt communicators, planning the date, making sure to spark good conversation, because most women put that on us as well, and generally pulling out all the stops to make a great first impression, while the woman is pretending to be texting with her mom while she's actually swiping on other dudes during your date. Far too many women have low intent and low investment on first dates these days, so why should us men approach it any differently? If this is just a casual one of many type thing for the woman, then she can casually pay for her own portion of an expensive date, or learn how to accept initial dates that are a much lower investment on the man's part. Again, I know this one is going to be tough on the men and probably result in less dates in an already tough dating market. But my intent should not be tied to my wallet and how much I'm willing to spend on the first few dates. My intent should be tied to how engaged I am during dates, how much effort I put into getting to know a woman's personality, and the small things I may be doing that stand out from the other 35 men this woman's dating at the same time. Another very common point that I hear women state as to why men should pay for expensive first dates is because the man initiated the date, which I can half understand the logic behind, but I'm still going to push back on it. To be fair here, I do kind of understand where women are coming from on this one, because there are some people in general that feel like the person asking someone else to go somewhere or do something has somehow agreed to pay for a said thing, but that's not always true. Friends ask friends if they want to go on a trip with them all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person asking is signing up to pay for anything. Your friend may ask you if you want to meet up for lunch or dinner one day, but that doesn't indicate they're agreeing to pay for your half, especially if they didn't explicitly state that they would. Now, if we're talking about dating, let's just say that the man does have to pay for the first date because he's the one who asked the woman out. My question is, why does said date have to be an expensive one? Where is it implied that just because the man initiated the conversation and plans the first few dates, that those experiences have to have a certain dollar amount attached to them in order to be deemed successful? Again, 30 plus years ago, it was the standard for a man who asked a woman out to spend a lot of moolah on the first few dates. But like I just talked about with this modern dating culture, a man paying for expensive first dates should not be considered a given. Not only that, but my most important counterpoint to this subject is that due to biology, women don't ask men out. So this point really isn't even fair. Men have no choice but to initiate the first date if they want to meet a woman. And most women have no choice but to wait for a man to initiate the first contact because women suck at it and are usually afraid to do so because it's simply not in their nature. Look, I'm a traditional man, so I'm not complaining about this at all. I'm good with it. But you're trying to make men out to be the bad guys or cheap or busted or whatever mess you're coming up with these days for not shelling out a bunch of money on a date that never would have even happened had the man not initiated the contact in the first place. I'm sure there are a few women out there who have asked men out on dates before, but the fact of the matter is that the bulk of the women out there wouldn't even have a man if the man didn't approach you first, because that's just how nature works. This isn't just a choice that either side can simply decide to switch up or change. Men have always been the ones who pursue women, but pursuing doesn't have to mean paying for expensive dates for someone he barely even knows yet. Once again, especially in this modern dating culture. And of course, I've had a few women fire back at me and say, well, the man asked me out. I was perfectly fine and peaceful on my own before he asked me out. And I could be doing other things instead of going out on a date with a stingy man. First off, stop capping, because the man could be doing other things as well. Too many of y'all females out there acting like you're some damn big-time CEO that's flying across the country, running billion-dollar companies, and have a schedule that's jam-packed with responsibilities and new adventure at every single turn. I'm sorry, but you're not that important or that busy. So you can save this attitude that you took time out of your incredibly hectic schedule just to grant some peon of a man your presence. So now he owes you all these things. Newsflash here, men are oftentimes more busy than women are. One of the reasons why most men, including myself, don't have many pictures or selfies in our phones is because we're actually out doing-ish and accomplishing things in our lives. Not sitting up on the phone all day, taking hundreds of duck lip photos until we find the perfect one to post on social media for our next thirst-trapping expedition. Ask most men, and they can list off at least a few active hobbies that they do on a regular basis. While most women's hobbies usually consist of them sitting at home and watching multiple TV series, going to the bar, which is not really a hobby, or scrolling on TikTok all day. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all women are like this. I'm just telling you what kind of responses I've personally received from each gender whenever we casually talk about our personal hobbies. Secondly, if you women were so fine and peaceful all on your own, then just deny the man's date request and tell him you're not interested. It's just that simple. Nobody is forcing you to accept a date request that interrupts your hectic thirst trap schedule. So by all means, go right ahead and focus more on your digital street cred, and don't ever think you have to patronize us undeserving men with your heavenly presence, especially if you don't think you're going to get a fancy date out of the encounter. Who cares that if the man approaching you could be the opportunity you've been waiting for to finally meet the person meant for you? Instead of being flattered enough at the fact that a man found you interesting enough to risk getting rejected just to ask you out, you instead focus on the fact that he didn't pony up a wad of cash on the first date. The whole discussion around this point reminds me of the old tried and true female war cry. I know what I want, I know what I deserve, and I'm not going to settle for anything less than what I deserve. You're so focused on a whole list of these superficial things that a man must come to the table with, including expensive first dates, that your overly inflated sense of self-worth and ego is causing you to risk losing out on the person for you. Yes, The man initiated the date. But just because he's not willing to shower you with lavish first dates doesn't mean that the encounter will be a waste of your time or disturb your peace. You could just as easily go out with a man that does pay for an expensive first date and have a nightmare of a time, especially because sometimes men attach certain expectations to the price of the date that a lot of women aren't willing to pay, which moves along perfectly to my next point. And that is the fact that neither the man nor the woman really owe each other anything on the first few dates other than, hopefully, good conversation around your overall compatibility and what a relationship between you two would look like. I kind of touched on this a minute ago, but many women often treat first dates as if men owe them something expensive because the woman's time is valuable and because she's special. But I completely disagree with that. First off, how the hell does the man know you're special when he just met you? You feel about as special to him as he feels special to you after only a few conversations and agreeing to meet up in person. The same way women don't owe a man sex or intimacy on the first date, which I completely agree with, is the same way we don't owe you a lavish first date either. Your first few dates are just the beginning of you both testing your compatibility with each other. So the focus should be on good conversation and getting the tough questions out of the way first, not sleeping together or keeping score of how much the dinner bill is. As I also just said a few minutes ago, plenty of women don't even feel like they owe a man the courtesy of a polite rejection and instead will block or ghost him after a date. Yet they still feel entitled to the princess treatment from the very beginning. That's complete lunacy to me. If you're a woman judging a man based off of how much money he spends on the very first date, then you're just as superficial as any man who judges you based strictly off of your looks or what sex acts you're willing to do on the first date as well. The same way you don't know him enough to be having sexy time with him is the same way he doesn't know you well enough to be spending $150 plus on a first date with you. The sense of entitlement some women have these days really does boggle my mind. What I really find funny is that some men also propose cheap or inexpensive dates to crap test you and see who you really are. And lots of women out there are failing miserably because of their egos. I've had lots of conversations with women who claim to be humble, nice, and all these other incredible things, but then turn into demons when things don't go their way, or if they don't get exactly what they wanted, how they wanted it. If you agree to a first date with a man that isn't overly expensive, but it goes extremely well with great conversation and you two seeming like a great matchup to that point, how was adding $100 or even $200 to that date going to make it any better? Why would you feel owed or entitled to anything more than that for a first date? Here's a real question for the women out there. What matters more on the first date? What you can get out of a man and how much money he can spend on you, or how well you actually get along with each other? On second thought, don't answer that one, ladies, because I may not end up liking the answer that I receive. Boy. I'm sure plenty of women will answer back with both, but life doesn't always work that way. And like I said before, you may end up missing out on the love of your life because you're too focused on the love of money. I'm a firm believer that keeping the expectations low on the first few dates just makes for a more comfortable situation for both sides involved. Men won't feel entitled to any kind of physical contact or even a second date just because they spent 150 on a woman. And women don't have to feel pressured into giving a man a second date or having to get physical with him in any way just because he just paid for an expensive dinner or whatever else he just spent that 150 on. The last thing you want to do is have your first few dates feeling transactional or like you're keeping score of who owes who what once the date is over. So sticking with less expensive and simple first dates allows you to focus more on conversation and chemistry, not all these other distractions. And the last of many reasons why men should keep first dates fairly inexpensive is because the last thing a man wants to do in dating is set unrealistic expectations right from the very beginning. On top of the fact that men who lead with their money are just plain weak. Men who immediately start taking women out on lavish dates are oftentimes creating a standard that she's going to expect him to uphold throughout the entire relationship, which is something that most men are unable to do. Again, back in the old days, it was pretty much implied that first dates were the man putting his best foot forward and that subsequent dates would be more casual, fun, and less expensive. But it almost seems like the exact opposite is true in this modern dating culture. A lot of women are now seeing expensive first dates as a barrier to entry to dating, and they expect even more lavish dates, gifts, and presents later on down the road. I've seen more than my fair share of dating profiles where women will say things like, "Don't introduce me to a lifestyle you can't maintain." Or you can substitute the word lifestyle for the word vibe instead. Either way, the message is pretty clear. These kinds of women expect the full-blown princess treatment throughout the entire duration of the relationship, not just at the beginning. And this is exactly why I suggest holding off on forking over a ton of dough on a woman for a date until you know she's worth it. Unless you're a real baller and money is no object to you, fancy dinner dates and things like that are for special occasions or as a treat for your woman to show her how much you love and appreciate her. They're not something that these women should expect to be experiencing every single week. If you meet a woman and start spending $150 a date on her right away, then guess what happens eventually? That becomes not enough for certain women, and they start wanting even more expensive dates later on in the relationship. That date for $150 is considered standard practice now for her. So when it's time to celebrate a special occasion or treat your woman to something nice, you better be prepared to spend $250 or maybe even more than that. Bottom line is that nowadays, how a man leads off financially with dating is how many women expect men to continue spending throughout the relationship. And if you ain't got the Benjamins to keep up with that kind of lifestyle, your woman will probably go find a man who can. The other point that I won't get all deep into here, because I did a whole podcast on it already, is that only weak men lead off relationships with their money. Oftentimes, men will spend lots of money on first dates in order to almost buy a woman's affection. And that's probably the absolute weakest thing that a grown man can do in life. If that woman you're trying to date doesn't love you for who you are and not just what you can provide for her, then she ain't worth your time and energy, my guy. It's better to be single and alone rather than to be with some harpy who's probably cheating on you, that's only with you because you spent more on the first date than the other guys did. That should already tell you where her morals and values are, and you should be running for the hills ASAP. If you end up staying with this kind of woman, you're just setting yourself up for getting milked like a cow for all your money later on down the road, on top of getting hit with the emotional damage that's soon to follow once she cheats on you or leaves you for someone more wealthy. Now, I'm not saying to spend nothing on a first date, just that only weak men lead with money and try to buy love because they have to make up for things they lack, like personality and character, instead of doing what real men do, which is focus on building themselves up as men and letting the right woman come along at the right time. So I told you at the beginning of this podcast that I'd give you my thoughts on how men should handle the first few dates with a woman in this modern dating culture. So here it goes. Even though I'm sure most women out there are calling me all kinds of names right now and saying that I'm cheap, I've already said that's not the case at all. I have no issue spending money on a woman when the time is right. And if a man finds a woman who is genuinely a good woman that sticks with him through thick and thin, then she deserves to be spoiled once she proves herself worth being spoiled. But until that happens, the solution to this whole conversation is actually very simple. As a man planning the first few dates with a woman, keep the cost low, but find fun things to do that gives you a chance to interact with each other and get to know each other in a more relaxed, less formal, and less pressurized situation. Find out if the woman has any hobbies or interests that you both may share, or see if one of these hobbies or interests could be something you could turn into a fun or interesting, inexpensive date for both of you. This is really a good idea for men at the beginning of the dating phase, because let's pretend that at the end of the first date, the woman decides she doesn't like you, which is usually how it goes, meaning that the woman doesn't like the man, not the reverse. At the end of the day, you picked a date where you got to see or experience something different. So it wasn't a total loss on your end, even if things didn't work out. Personally speaking, expensive dinner dates, for example, just seem to feel like a complete loss at the end of the day if the woman ended up not being interested in you. Number one, it's really just very overpriced food that you're going to end up evacuating later on the next night anyway. And two, fancy restaurant dates can often add to the feeling of both parties being worried about expectations during the date because of the kind of atmosphere they often set. Dim lighting, fine wine, fancy waiters, expensive food, etc. It's just something that should be saved until later on when there's a stronger connection between you and your woman. I mean, I 100% feel this way about fancy dates in general, but I'm just using the restaurant example here because it seems to be the most common thing most men way overspend on for a first date. The TLDR version to this point is simply to plan cheaper dates focused on less formality and more on a casual experience. Hold up now, all you horn dogs. I don't mean that kind of casual experience. Anyway, a casual experience that centers around something interesting or fun, and use that to win a woman over instead of your credit card number. If things go well, awesome, you're on the right track. If they don't, then no problem. The investment was low and you can walk away not feeling used with unfulfilled expectations to go along with a nice size hole in your wallet you made as well. I'll end things on that note and wrap this podcast up here. When all is said and done, I do want to make it clear once again that as relationships grow, progress, and become more established, then obviously a good man is going to start paying more for expensive dates and spending more money on his woman at that time. To me, that's just a given, even if he's not getting any sexy time in return. However, when we're discussing the first few dates and a potential relationship literally being on the second step of the discovery phase, the first step being phone calls, text messages, etc., then I firmly believe that men should keep their initial financial investments low so that they don't end up getting played for their money or even sending the wrong first impression that this woman is deserving of treatment she hasn't earned yet. And yes, ladies, I said earned. The same way you women look at your kitty cat as being a resource that must be earned because you just don't give it away freely to everyone. Well, not some of you anyway, but that's a whole nother subject in itself. Is the exact same way that us men treat our checkbooks as well. When it comes to dating, modern women have been doing what's in their best interest at the expense of men for far too long. So it's time that us men wake up and realize that just like many other things in this world, dating just ain't how it used to be. As always, if you're listening in on YouTube, I appreciate a like, a subscribe, or you leaving a comment. I'm continuing to try to bring you great content, and I hope that you enjoy the kind of podcast that I'm bringing to you. Thanks for listening in. I will catch you on the next one.